There are men history kills twice, once with a blade and once with a legend. William Wallace was killed 3 times, once at Smithfield, once by the myth that replaced him, and once more, every time someone watches Braveheart and believes that was the real story. The real story is worse. And the real story matters more. It is the morning of August 23rd, 1305. The air at Smithfield smells like livestock. This is London's great open-air meat market, the place where cattle are driven in from the countryside, butchered and sold. Today the crowd is larger than usual. Thousands of Londoners have gathered in the dirt and the straw, pressing forward, craning for a view. But they are not here for cattle. They are here to watch a man be taken apart, piece by piece, while he is still alive. Somewhere in the crowd, a horse is being led forward. Tied to the back of that horse, stripped naked, his body already torn and bloodied from 4 miles of cobblestones and filth, is the most wanted man in the British Isles. His name is William Wallace, and what is about to happen to him is so much worse than anything Braveheart showed you that the film did not even attempt it. Mel Gibson's Wallace screams freedom, and the axe falls, and the screen fades to a kind of noble martyrdom. The real execution did not fade to anything. It went on and on. Each stage was designed not just to kill William Wallace, but to unmake him, to erase the idea that he had ever been a man at all. In the next hour, the English crown will hang him, cut him open while he still breathes, burn his organs in front of his face, remove his head, and hack his body into 4 pieces. 5 acts of destruction, every one of them planned in advance, rehearsed like a performance, and staged for maximum public horror. That famous cry of freedom? There is no historical record of Wallace shouting anything from the scaffold. But here is the strange part. History did produce a freedom speech far more powerful than anything a screenwriter ever invented. It just came 15 years later from a completely different document. William Wallace was about 35 years old. He was not a peasant farmer. He was not a simple Highland warrior with a painted face. He was minor Scottish gentry, born around 1270, near Paisley in Renfrewshire, educated enough to read and write in multiple languages, and connected enough to understand the political machinery that was grinding his country apart. Braveheart gave audiences a folk hero in a kilt. The real Wallace was sharper than that and more dangerous. 8 years earlier, Wallace had done something no one in Scotland expected. At the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297, he had destroyed an English army, not by matching it in strength, but by luring it across a narrow bridge and cutting it to pieces on the far side. The bridge was the entire point. Braveheart removed the bridge entirely, turning a brilliant tactical ambush into a generic open-field charge. The real battle was won by patience, terrain, and timing, not by a speech on horseback. The victory made Wallace guardian of Scotland, the man who ruled in the absence of a king. That glory lasted less than a year. At Falkirk in 1298, Edward I brought the full weight of English longbowmen and heavy cavalry against Wallace's schiltrons, dense formations of Scottish spearmen, and shattered them. Wallace survived, but his reputation as an invincible commander did not. He resigned as guardian. For the next 7 years he lived in the margins, a guerrilla, a fugitive, possibly traveling as far as France and Rome to seek alliances that never materialized. On the other side of this story were not monsters. The English soldiers garrisoned across Scotland were often ordinary men stationed far from home in a country that despised them. Many of the Scots who cooperated with English rule did so because they had families, land, and no appetite for another war they would lose. This was not good versus evil. It was power versus resistance, and the people caught between them had no good choices. By the summer of 1305, most of Scotland had submitted. Treaties had been signed. Nobles had bent the knee. The resistance was over, except for one man. Wallace had never surrendered, had never sworn allegiance, had never stopped, and Edward I 66 years old and running out of patience, wanted him found. Not captured quietly, not imprisoned, found, taken to London, and destroyed in public so completely that no Scot would ever dare follow his example. Edward I had been king for 33 years. He had conquered Wales, expelled England's Jewish population, fought in the Crusades, and buried 2 wives. The chroniclers called him Longshanks for his height. He stood over 6 feet tall, towering over most men of his era. He was legalistic, methodical, and ruthless when crossed. He had spent a decade trying to absorb Scotland into his kingdom. Wallace was the splinter he could not extract. Edward's contempt for Scottish resistance was not abstract. He is reported to have said of Scotland that a man does good business when he rids himself of a turd. That is not the language of a dispassionate ruler managing a border dispute. That is a man who took defiance personally. And Wallace, the commoner who had beaten an English army, who had styled himself guardian, who refused every offer of submission, was the ultimate personal insult. Here is the detail that matters most for understanding what comes next. Wallace had never sworn fealty to Edward. Never. Not once. Every Scottish noble who submitted had done so formally, bending the knee, speaking the oath. Wallace simply never did it. And this created a legal absurdity that Edward would exploit with devastating cruelty. The English crown charged Wallace with treason, betraying a king he had never acknowledged. The order went out: find Wallace. The man who answered that call was Sir John de Menteith, a Scottish knight serving as English-appointed sheriff of Dumbarton. Menteith was not a cartoon villain. He was a pragmatist in an occupied country. He had lands. He had a family. He had made his peace with English rule because the alternative was ruin. On the night of August 3rd, 1305, Wallace came to Robroyston, a quiet spot near Glasgow. The traditional account says Menteith arranged a meeting. Perhaps he promised information. Perhaps he offered shelter. Wallace came because he trusted, or because he had no better option after 7 years of running. One account adds a detail so specific it has the texture of memory rather than invention. A servant named Jack Short, part of Wallace's inner circle, allegedly agreed to signal the English soldiers waiting nearby. The signal was simple. He would turn Wallace's bed upside down. When the soldiers saw it through the window, they would know Wallace was inside and unarmed. Wallace was seized. The man who had evaded English capture for 7 years was taken not on a battlefield, but in a quiet place, by people he thought were on his side. Think about the arithmetic of betrayal. Wallace had fought for Scotland for 8 years. He had given up everything: title, safety, any hope of a normal life. And the man who ended it all was not an English soldier, he was a Scot. The English did not defeat Wallace, they bought him. The man who had evaded capture for 7 years, who had burned English garrisons and killed English soldiers and refused every offer of peace, was taken in a quiet room by a man he thought was on his side. That is how resistance ends, not on a battlefield, in a bedroom, with a handshake and a bed turned upside down. They bought him. Wallace was taken to Dumbarton Castle, then south. The journey from Scotland to London took roughly 3 weeks, 400 miles on medieval roads, as a bound prisoner. That is roughly the distance from New York to Pittsburgh, except there were no roads worth the name, no rest stops, and the man making the journey knew what was waiting at the other end. He arrived in London on August 22nd. He had less than 24 hours to live. The scaffold was already being built. The charges were already decided. The trial was already scheduled. This was not justice. This was logistics. We do not know what Wallace said during those 3 weeks on the road. We do not know if he was fed well or starved, if he was beaten or left alone, if he spoke to his guards or stared at the road in silence. The historical record goes quiet between capture and trial. What we know is that by the time he arrived in London, every detail of his death had already been arranged by men who had never met him. On the morning of August 23rd, Wallace was brought to Westminster Hall, one of the largest medieval halls in Europe. The roof soars nearly 90 feet above the stone floor. It was built to make kings feel powerful and everyone else feel small. Before the trial started, Wallace was given a crown, not a real one, a garland of oak leaves pressed onto his head in mockery. He was crowned as if he were king of outlaws. It was calculated humiliation. The guardian of Scotland, the hero of Stirling Bridge, reduced to a man standing in an English courtroom wearing a crown made of leaves. Every piece of this was theater. The charges were read: seditions, homicides, depredations, fires, and felonies spanning 8 years of resistance. The charges framed Wallace not as a soldier fighting a war, but as a criminal who had terrorized a lawful kingdom. The distinction mattered. Soldiers can be ransomed. Criminals can only be punished. Every charge assumed that Edward I was the rightful king of Scotland. If he was, then Wallace was a traitor. But Wallace had spent his entire adult life on the principle that Scotland was a sovereign nation with its own crown. The trial did not address this argument. It did not need to. The verdict was written before he walked in. Later Scottish tradition records Wallace's response: "I could not be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject." Whether he said exactly this, we cannot be certain, but the legal argument was real, and it was devastating in its logic. You cannot betray a king you never served. The court did not engage with this point. It moved to sentencing. There was no deliberation. There was no pause for consideration. The machine had been assembled. It needed only to run. The sentence was pronounced: for treason, hanging; for robbery and murder, drawing and disembowelment; for outlawry, beheading; for crimes committed across Scotland, quartering with the parts to be displayed in the towns where he had done the most damage. Each element of the punishment was matched to a specific category of crime. This was not rage, it was bureaucracy. They stripped him naked. This was not incidental. Public nudity was part of the punishment design, the deliberate erasure of dignity, status, and identity. A naked man is not a guardian. He is not a knight. He is not a symbol. He is just a body. They bound him to a hurdle, a wooden frame, and attached it to the back of a horse. And then the horse began to move, and 4 miles of London opened up before him. The route from Westminster to Smithfield was not the shortest path. It was chosen deliberately, winding through the busiest streets and market districts of the city. 4 miles of cobblestones, the distance from one end of Central Park to the other, except instead of joggers and tourists, the route was lined with thousands of people screaming at a bleeding man. Some jeered, some threw refuse, some simply stared. The stones and cobbles tore at Wallace's skin as the horse dragged him forward. By the time he reached Smithfield, his body was already a ruin of abrasions and raw flesh. A man dragged naked over 4 miles of medieval cobblestones would have his skin stripped away in sheets. The pain would be extraordinary, and this was not the punishment. This was the commute. The punishment had not started yet. Smithfield was London's great livestock market, the open ground where cattle were slaughtered and butchered every day of the week. The choice of location was not accidental. Edward's administration could have chosen any open ground in London. They chose the place where animals were taken apart. The message was not subtle. Medieval public punishment depended on communal witness. The idea that justice was only real if it was seen. The Londoners lining the streets were performing a civic function by watching. Their jeers were expected. Their presence was required. This is the part of the story that makes modern people uncomfortable, because it asks an honest question. Would you have watched? In 1305, the answer for most Londoners was yes, eagerly. Put yourself on that street for a moment. You are standing in a crowd. You can smell the market stalls and the horse dung and the sweat of the people pressing against you. A horse comes around the corner. Behind it, something is being dragged. It takes you a moment to realize it is a man. His skin is torn. His body is caked in mud and blood. He is alive. He is looking at you. What do you do? In 1305, people cheered. When the horse finally stopped at Smithfield, Wallace was pulled from the hurdle and brought to the scaffold. The execution apparatus was already assembled. The gallows, the block, the ropes, the blades. Around them, the crowd of Smithfield pressed in. London's Livestock Market, the ground where animals were butchered every day. And today the English crown had brought its most prized catch here for the same purpose. The first act was hanging. A noose was placed around Wallace's neck, and he was hauled into the air. But this was not a hanging designed to kill. The drop was short, just enough to choke, not enough to break the neck. Wallace hung there, his body convulsing, his legs kicking against nothing, until the executioner judged he was close enough to the edge. Then they cut him down. He hit the ground alive. That was the point. He needed to be alive for what came next. Each act followed the sentence to the letter. A legal checklist being executed in order. A man killed in battle dies in chaos. Wallace died in order. The second act was emasculation. The sources describe this with the clinical detachment of legal procedure. It was part of the sentence, not an improvisation. What was cut from Wallace was thrown into a fire that had been prepared nearby. The crowd watched. Some turned away. Most did not. He was forced to witness his own body being destroyed, piece by piece, while still conscious enough to understand what was happening to him. This is the part Braveheart could not show you. Not because of the violence, the film had plenty of that, but because the reality is so systematic, so procedural, that it defies the Hollywood grammar of noble death. There is no swelling music here, no slow motion, no last defiant gaze. There is a man on the ground in unimaginable agony, watching his own flesh burn, and the crowd is watching him watch. The third act was disembowelment. The executioner opened Wallace's abdomen and drew out his entrails. These too were burned. The medical reality is that the human body can remain conscious for a horrifyingly long time during evisceration because the major blood vessels are not immediately compromised. Wallace may have been aware through much of it. He may not have been. The sources do not tell us when exactly consciousness ended. They only tell us that the process continued regardless. The crowd at Smithfield watched all of it. They had come for this. They had positioned themselves for the best view. Children were lifted onto shoulders. Vendors sold food at the edges of the crowd. This was London in 1305. Public execution was not a shameful secret. It was a civic event, attended the way later generations would attend a hanging at Tyburn or a bear baiting at Southwark. The people watching Wallace die were not monsters. They were ordinary Londoners doing what their culture told them was normal. And that may be the most disturbing detail of all. The fourth act was beheading. Wallace's head was struck from his body. After everything else, the blade may have been the closest thing to mercy that morning offered. The fifth and final act was quartering. Wallace's body was divided into 4 parts. The limbs separated from what remained by axe blows. The pieces were set aside. They had somewhere to be. Edward had already decided where each one was going. 5 acts, 1 body, and every single step was written into the legal sentence before Wallace even entered the courtroom. This was not a mob killing. This was not battlefield rage. This was the considered, premeditated policy of the English crown, administered by professionals in front of a paying public. 5 acts, 1 body, and every single step written into the legal sentence before Wallace even entered the courtroom. The executioner wiped his blade. The fire crackled with what it had been fed, and the crowd of Smithfield stood in the smoke and the silence and the smell of a livestock market that had, for one morning, served its original purpose on a different kind of animal. The horror of Wallace's death is not that it was savage, it is that it was civilized. When it was over, the crowd began to disperse. The executioner cleaned his tools. The fire at the base of the scaffold continued to burn what had been pulled from Wallace's body. The 5 pieces of what had been William Wallace were collected by officials and prepared for transport. The head was dipped in tar. The tar would preserve the features, keep the skin from rotting too quickly. They wanted people to recognize that face for as long as possible. Wallace's tarred head was mounted on a pike and placed on London Bridge, the most visible public location in the city. Every person crossing the Thames, every merchant entering the city, every foreign visitor arriving by the South Bank would see it. It was the medieval equivalent of a billboard, and the message was simple. This is what rebellion looks like. This is how it ends. The 4 quarters of Wallace's body were sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Perth, and Stirling. These were not random choices. Each town was a strategic center, a place where Scottish resistance had been strongest or where English authority needed reinforcing. One man turned into 5 warnings planted across a nation like flags in conquered territory. The message was identical in every location. A piece of human wreckage displayed on the town walls, visible to every person who passed through the gates. Walk through that gate. Look up. See a human arm nailed to the stone above you. That arm once held a sword at Stirling Bridge. Now it is rotting in the Scottish rain as a reminder of what happens when you fight back. That was what Edward wanted every Scot to see, every day, until the flesh fell from the bone and the bone crumbled into dust. And here is where the story should end. A body in pieces, a head on a bridge, an entire nation silenced by fear. That is what Edward wanted. That is what the execution was designed to achieve. The complete and permanent destruction of William Wallace, not just as a man, but as an idea. The only problem is, it did not work, not even close. Edward I had designed Wallace's execution to end Scottish resistance forever. The logic was sound. You capture the symbol. You destroy the symbol in public. You scatter the remains as proof. You wait for submission. And for a few months it seemed to work. Scotland was quiet. The nobles who had already submitted stayed submitted. The common people who had followed Wallace kept their heads down and their mouths shut. But something was happening beneath the surface that Edward's intelligence network either missed or misunderstood. Wallace's death was not silencing the resistance. It was radicalizing it. Within a year, Robert the Bruce, a Scottish nobleman who had spent years carefully navigating between English submission and Scottish resistance, began making moves that would have been unthinkable while Wallace was alive and Edward's threat was still abstract. Wallace's execution had turned Edward's threat from abstract to concrete, and for Bruce, seeing what submission ultimately meant, seeing what the English crown would do to a man who resisted, may have been the final push. In February of 1306, less than 6 months after Wallace's quartered remains were nailed to the walls of 4 Scottish towns, Robert the Bruce murdered his chief rival John Comyn in a church and declared himself King of Scotland. The timing is not a coincidence. Bruce had watched what happened to Wallace. He had seen the head on London Bridge, he had seen the quarters on the gates, and he drew the only conclusion that a man of his ambition and intelligence could draw. If submission leads to this, then the only option is to win. Bruce was not a romantic. He was a calculator. He had watched for years, weighing the cost of rebellion against the cost of compliance. Wallace's execution tipped the scale. Not because Bruce loved Wallace. The two men had a complicated relationship and were sometimes rivals, but because Wallace's death showed Bruce what the end of compliance looked like. It looked like Smithfield. It looked like 5 pieces of a man nailed to 5 walls, and Bruce decided he would rather die fighting for a crown than live to see his own body scattered across Scotland as a warning. Stop and think about what Edward achieved. He executed Wallace to prevent future rebellion. 6 months later, he had a full-scale rebellion on his hands, led by a man who would eventually win. Wallace's death did not kill the resistance. It created the conditions for its greatest success. Edward I, the man who called himself the Hammer of the Scots, had accidentally forged the blade that would cut Scotland free. Edward spent the last 2 years of his life trying to crush Bruce's rebellion. He failed. In July of 1307, at the age of 68, Edward I died at Berg by Sands, on the English side of the Scottish border, within sight of Scotland, unable to finish what he had started. The Hammer of the Scots died marching toward one more war he would never fight. He had spent a decade trying to absorb Scotland. He had spent a fortune building castles and garrisoning towns. He had captured the symbol of Scottish resistance and destroyed him in the most public way the medieval world could imagine. And it had achieved nothing. The resistance he tried to crush was now led by a king, backed by a cause, and fueled by the memory of exactly what English mercy looked like when it arrived at Smithfield. His son, Edward II, was not the man his father was. Scotland would exploit that weakness ruthlessly. In 1314, 9 years after Wallace's execution, Robert the Bruce defeated an English army at the Battle of Bannockburn, one of the most decisive Scottish victories in history. 9 years after Edward scattered Wallace's body across Scotland, a Scottish army destroyed an English army on open ground. The man who was supposed to be the final warning became the first chapter of victory. The battle secured Scottish independence for a generation, and the chain of events that produced it began not at Bannockburn, but at Smithfield, not with a sword, but with a scaffold, not with a king, but with a commoner who refused to kneel. The body was destroyed, the idea survived, and the idea won. No part of Wallace's body has ever been identified or recovered. He has no grave, no tomb, no bones for a nation to visit. In the most literal sense, Edward succeeded in erasing William Wallace's body from the earth. And Sir John de Menteith, the man who betrayed Wallace at Robroyston, he kept his lands, he kept his title, he lived comfortably under English patronage for years. Then, in one of history's most quietly devastating reversals, Menteith switched sides. When Bruce rose to power, Menteith joined him, fighting for the same cause he had helped destroy by handing over Wallace. Whether he ever lay awake at night thinking about the man he had delivered to Smithfield, the record does not say. Scotland remembered, and Scotland has never forgiven. But a body is not an idea, and ideas do not need graves. The William Wallace that most people carry in their heads is Mel Gibson. Blue face paint, a Scottish accent no actual Scot has ever produced. A charge at Stirling on an open field with no bridge. The face paint was a Pictish practice from 1,000 years before Wallace was born, and the kilt had not been invented yet. And the Battle of Stirling Bridge was won precisely because of the bridge, which Braveheart removed entirely, turning a brilliant tactical ambush into a generic charge. The bridge was the entire point of Stirling Bridge. Without it, the battle is just another medieval skirmish. With it, the battle is a masterpiece of terrain and timing by a commander who understood that you do not fight a stronger enemy on his terms. You change the terms. There is no record of Wallace yelling freedom from the scaffold, no chronicle, no trial record, no eyewitness account. The iconic line was invented by a screenwriter in 1995. But here is the strange, almost eerie part of the story. The screenwriter invented a freedom cry for a man who never said it. And yet history itself produced words so much more powerful than any script that they have outlasted every film, every novel, and every myth that tried to replace them. Because history did produce a freedom speech, a real one, and it might be the greatest political declaration in Scottish history. In 1320, 15 years after Wallace's execution, 15 years after the English burned Wallace's entrails in front of his face, Scotland produced the greatest freedom declaration of the medieval world. The Scottish nobles sent a letter to Pope John XXII. It is known as the Declaration of Arbroath, and it contains a line, that has echoed through 7 centuries of Scottish identity. It is in truth not for glory, nor riches, nor honors that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone which no honest man gives up but with life itself. That is the real freedom speech, not a shout from a scaffold, but a carefully argued declaration from a nation that had watched its champion dismembered and refused to stop fighting anyway. Go back to Smithfield, go back to that morning, the livestock market, the scaffold, the crowd. A naked man dragged behind a horse, a crown of oak leaves on his head, 5 acts of destruction, 1 body turned into 5 pieces and scattered across a kingdom. Edward I designed that morning to be the last word on William Wallace. He was wrong. The last word came 15 years later, in ink and parchment, from a country that refused to stay silent. Edward had 5 acts of destruction. Scotland had 1 sentence, and the sentence won. Wallace never said those words. He did not need to. He had already lived them. The body was destroyed. The idea was indestructible.